Well, hello everybody. Today I have Bernardo Kastrup with me, whom many of you know, and I'm very excited about this. We're going to be discussing analytic idealism, sort of roughly centered on his newest book, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. We're going to talk a little bit about the book, some of the decisions he made in it, and then some of the sort of tensions or potential concerns I have with some of the metaphysical views. And we're just going to discuss them, hash them out, and see where we get. Does that sound good?
I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent, wonderful. Okay, so I've pre-prepared these questions, Bernardo. So this is a little bit unusual for me. I usually just shoot from the hip, but I also have some questions at the end of this from members of the community. So I want to make sure I represented their questions correctly as well. So I thought we'd start off by talking about the differences between analytic idealism in a nutshell and your previous work, sort of expounding on analytic idealism, which was Materialism is Baloney. And they're actually, I confess, the only two books of yours I've read, although I've listened to you on YouTube quite a bit. So one thing I noticed as a difference between the two was that Nutshell sort of switches out a lot of the metaphorical talk that was present in Materialism is Baloney, and instead it's sort of going for much more direct philosophical arguments, predominantly attacking physicalism. And then you have this, I thought, quite amusing line, sort of about 70% of the way through the book, where you say, like, I haven't even told you about idealism yet, and we're already 2/3 of the way through. And you sort of suggest that with physicalism out the way, analytic idealism sort of owns the stage. And
you see, mainly because the criticisms of physicalism suggest the alternative already. That's what I meant. Not that physicalism, if it's out of the way, then there is only one other alternative. I didn't mean that. But if you understand the criticisms I weaved about physicalism, you will immediately understand what would solve those issues. It suggests the alternative. So that's what I meant there.
Yeah, sure. Okay, yeah, great. So it seems then, at that point, you've introduced a whole lot of data that physicalism can't solve, and then you present analytic idealism, as I said, relatively quickly, and then show how, from that metaphysics, this sort of data would be sort of expected. So it seems to be a bit kind of an inference to best explanation kind of argument, which honestly I preferred to the sort of extensive use of metaphor in the previous work. But I just wondered if that sort of change of tack in how you're presenting it in Nutshell was motivated by anything particular, or just a desire to be different.
There have been several other books in between Materialism is Baloney and Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell, where I sort of experimented with the balance between metaphor and a direct, positive, explicit account, where I experimented between speaking more mythopoetic language and more unambiguous conceptual language. So between the two books, there was, for instance, The Idea of the World, which is downright academic. It's a collection of academic papers, basically, plus some new material that I added in the first part and in the final part to sort of bring it all together. And that's the other extreme from Materialism is Baloney. It's, jargon, very, very precise language, trying to resolve every ambiguity, which makes it, for philosophers, great to read because it's unambiguous and very clear. But for the general reader, it's heavy reading. So with this one, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell, I tried to strike a balance. And of course, if you only read Materialism is Baloney, it will not look like a balance. It will look like I'm really swinging to the other side. But before this latest book, I had swung even further to the other side. And I'm trying to bring it now to a balance where, while catering for the general educated public, I also try to run less risk of being misinterpreted or being guilty of ambiguity. So that's what I try to do there. And I try to make it short, above all. Short and direct.
Okay, all right. Well, that answers some questions. And I think I should probably read The Idea of the World at some point then, and maybe there are some things that I might pick up if I did it that way. But okay, for now, something else that I thought came through quite clearly in Nutshell was it seems as though you've become quite frustrated at being misinterpreted, a bit frustrated at being brushed off, or your comments being inverted into something else. So that there were sort of passages where you describe what it's like to try to raise criticisms to the dominant worldview, and they came across as not merely sort of factually retelling the story, but I think there's a palpable frustration in some of your language and in some. And so I wondered if I mean I assumed that that's based on your experience, so I wondered if why you think that might be, and why you felt, at least at this point, to start to tell people this.
Oh, my tone has been quite sharp for years. Um, I have not held my tongue, as Nietzsche said. Um, some of it is frustration, I think. I didn't verbalize it to myself that I'm going to out my frustrations. But of course, I am who I am. I have the experiences I had, and whatever I write emerges out of that. So I'm not going to put warm towels on this. It's very possible that some of that was authentic frustration. If it was not planned. It's just a spontaneous expression of frustration. Part of it, though, and maybe the part that sort of gave me an excuse to out what is in fact frustration, is that I try to mirror the tone in philosophical debate, in the culture at large today, not only in academia, but in the culture at large, discussions, in the media between public intellectuals and all that. The physicalist position tends to treat the alternatives with in a patronizing and disparaging manner. So I try to mirror some of that. And I have tried to do that for the past 15 years, to sort of put a mirror in front of that and say, I'm going to address you in the same way you address me. If you think I am illogical and I think you are illogical, then I'm going to refer to your illogical steps with the same disparaging language that you try to refer to what you perceive as my illogical steps. And I once wrote an essay in my blog in which I actually explained this. The attempt here is to prevent this psychological phenomenon in which the physicalist takes the moral high ground or the rational high ground, or at least sounds as if they had the natural, rational high ground. I want to deny that. And one way to deny that is to treat it the way I do, to just say it's absolute nonsense, it's bullshit. And maybe not use this particular word in the book, but to have that attitude that mirrors the attitude that the other side seems to have. You can go on my blog. I forgot the name of the essay I wrote it several years ago, in which I explained this. Now, of course, part of what I just told you is my trying to rationalize my frustration. Probably, it's not the story I tell myself, but I have enough experience with psychology to know that there is a high likelihood that part of it is that.
Yeah, so I mean, people get named and shamed in the book as well. It's not just general against physicalism. It's okay. Well,
then there are good reasons. If I name and shame, but then now I'm mentioning real facts. It's not just tone. It's about, okay, look, this happened, and I can prove it. So.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, well that makes sense of why you did that. Okay, so let's start to talk about some of the potential concerns I've had, and as I say, that's based on reading Baloney in Nutshell. So I'm not sure whether you watched the video link that I sent you a few days ago, the video I put on YouTube.
I wish I had. And Nathan, I haven't, but it's not because I dismiss it. Not at all. I'm in a phase in my life now in which even to carve out time to have this conversation with you, something else is not getting done. Hopefully it will be better once I am no longer the CEO of Synthetics, and I can breathe again. hopefully early next year. But no, I haven't watched it, but it's not because I don't take it seriously.
That's fine, because I mean, most of the complaints are here, so I'll put them to you, and that gives you a chance to answer them. So I think I sort of had two main sort of questions or things that I would need clarification on, and maybe it's in the idea of the world. So forgive me if you've already answered these. But so one was that, I've looked at different arguments for idealism in the philosophical literature. And historically, it seems to me that most of the arguments for idealism are based on sort of epistemic grounds, grounds of reason, maybe theories of perception, and so on. And then, as I mentioned to you earlier, Thomas Hoffaber's recently released a book, literally last year, arguing for idealism based on a sort of a philosophy of language argument, and how thoughts, because of language, thought must harmonize with facts, and so on. So these are all sort of a priori arguments that are put forward for idealism. And that's just the way philosophers do metaphysics. They tend to think about metaphysical truths as necessary truths. And so the kind of arguments that would be required would be a priori arguments, not ones that appeal to experience. But it seems as though many of your arguments are actually based on scientific ideas or results coming out of science. You use entropy, evolutionary theory, sort of very prominently. So how do you justify kind of using a priori evidence for what is ultimately a metaphysical position?
I don't do that often. I think if you do that, you're essentially making an epistemic argument, not necessarily a metaphysical argument. For instance, phenomenology or constructivism, even radical constructivism, which sort of flirts with metaphysics, maybe even kisses metaphysics, while trying to not do that. I think those are valid. They certainly add to the discussion, because at the end of the day, all we have is our epistemology, is what we can access in our knowledge. So anything beyond knowledge is per force always an inference of sorts. So there is nothing invalid about grounding metaphysics in epistemology. Now, why don't I do it more often? It has to do most likely with my history. I started my career as a scientist working at CERN. It was my dream job and my first job. I was 22 years old. I was already involved with physics in my dissertation work for 2 or 3 years prior to that. So science sort of shaped me, the scientific method of making observations, identifying a problem or a question, formulating a hypothesis, and then comparing the implications of that hypothesis with further observations. So there is a sense in which I do philosophy that way, as opposed to purely logical arguments or a priori arguments. I do philosophy the way a scientist would do physics, by looking at a histogram coming out of a calorimeter or a particle detector. And I'm not saying that this is better or worse than the way philosophy has traditionally been done. I don't know whether it's better. I don't know whether it's worse. All I can tell you is that it's the way I've been doing that because of who I am, how I grew up, the experiences I have had. It's what I know how to do. It's how I know how to operate.
Sure. Okay. So, but I mean, normally the reason why philosophers don't often, appeal to scientific results to come up with metaphysical claims is generally the idea is that metaphysical claims are necessary truths. We might not know whether it's true or not, but if idealism is true, it's necessarily true. And then Hume's fork is in the background. The idea would be that, well, science can only reveal to you contingent truths. And so the kind of evidence you can get from science just isn't the right sort of thing from which to draw metaphysical conclusions. Now, that can be doubted, obviously. And I understand from what you said that in some ways you're a scientist doing philosophy more than a philosopher who's dipping their toe into science to be interdisciplinary. But I think typically scientists that dip into philosophy often do so without sort of a full awareness of the kind of categorizations that go on philosophically.
Correct. Most
I'm
of
sure
them.
you right, exactly. So I think we're agreed with that. It's sort of like, you know, when the types of Dawkins try and do theology, they do it badly. And I think so. Sometimes scientists think that science is the path to metaphysics because philosophy has been dethroned or something. So I just wondered if you thought about how you can take these scientific results and genuinely draw metaphysical conclusions from them. You've got some kind of methodology that allows that.
I don't think you can ever draw a absolute or certain metaphysical conclusion from scientific results for the reasons you explained. But I also don't think human beings, bipedal apes, can know the truth for sure. I think that is fundamentally impossible. We are in the business of ranking hypotheses. What are the more plausible hypotheses? What are the least plausible hypotheses? And I tend to think that's the very best bipedal apes can do. It's to identify their own mistakes, allow themselves to be calibrated by empirical experience, and improve on their errors and get closer to truth. A friend of mine would love this statement, closer to truth, because he's the host of a program that goes by this name. So that's my inner attitude. I don't think that I am in the business of unveiling the absolute truths of existence, the ultimate ontological entities and realities. I think my business is to do better than the people who came before me, and to make less mistakes, or at least to become more aware of our mistakes. And empirical evidence, I think, is supremely useful in this sense, because it is out there. The risk when we are not empirically based at all is that a philosophy will end up, and I'm going to exaggerate. I don't mean this ultimately. I'm exaggerating to make a point. Philosophy could, if it's not empirically grounded, it could ultimately become a method for defending one's own prejudices. If all of philosophy is ungrounded in empiricism, you go back to scholasticism, you go back to the 13th century, in which things were very ungrounded, and everybody would defend their views they didn't use these terms at the time, but they would say, well, my intuitions tell me that. Well, that only tells me about your intuitions and not about what is true, you understand? So a priori arguments tend to fall prey to the patterns of human mentation with whatever biases and prejudices or blind spots or unexamined assumptions they have. I don't think the scholastics were correct in thinking that the human mind in supreme isolation could access the ultimate truths of existence. And of course, we've improved since then. Analytic philosophy today is not scholasticism. But I'm trying to establish a contrast here to highlight why I think empirical evidence is important, because it's so neutral. It's not completely neutral. Thomas Kuhn already explained that in 1969, but it's more neutral than a priori syllogisms, things like that, which I think are very dangerous.
Well, I think, yeah, okay. I think normally how metaphysical arguments play themselves out tends to be sort of, can you create a view that is coherent? I mean, coherence versus contradiction plays a major role in metaphysical debates. And of course, you are starting from, I think, certain core commitments and beliefs that you will, as Quine might think, are sort of at the inner core of your beliefs that are less subject to revision. And physicalism is one of those. I mean, this is the sort of frustration that I sometimes have, is you'll see an argument and it will mean, well, that can't be right because that would lead you to idealism. So there must be something wrong with our assumptions or something of that sort. So I take your point absolutely, that that everybody starts from somewhere. They start with their deepest held intuitions about, I think, generally about the ultimate nature of things. But that doesn't allow you to assert it unless you can unpack how that would affect everything and whether or not it then accords with other deeply held intuitions or convictions you have, whether they are coherent, whether they result in bizarre. I mean, David Lewis is the person I cut my teeth in metaphysics, and I don't know how much of his work you know, but what I think is so beautiful about it is he takes his Humean conception of everything being loose and separate to the extreme, and his correspondence theory of truth to the extreme, and so has the multiverse, even more than the Everettian multiverse, possible worlds. But because he's being so consistent, he accepts that's where he ends and bites the bullet. And so you're left sort of unpacking where these core assumptions lead. And then, of course, at that point now, you don't then usually turn to things like empirical evidence, because they're usually, a good metaphysical theory should leave the empirical evidence alone almost. And as I think analytic idealism mainly does. But it kind of tells you what you have to buy to get it, and then you compare it on other grounds like parsimony or strength or other aesthetic.
I'm fully with you that any metaphysical theory should be at least internally consistent. It should not contradict itself. Unfortunately, lots of them do contradict themselves. But I don't think it is enough, because if you just look at not only the history of philosophy, but the present state of philosophy, unless we can ground what we are saying in something that is objective and observable, we never reach consensus. We never resolve issues. Everybody still has their own opinion, elaborated in more and more sophisticated and obscurantist ways. That things like eliminativism and illusionism still exist and are still being published in academic papers, shows you that if we stick to a prioris, it's a circus, and it becomes the method of elaborating on your own prejudices and never reaching a conclusion that is shared by the community. And so there is a power to empirical evidence that in science has been the arbiter of what is plausible, what is not, what can be discarded, and what can be entertained as serious. And I think there is value in trying to bring some of that to philosophy, because empirical evidence can have metaphysical implications, at least in the sense that it can rule out certain things. It may not be positive evidence that singles out one theory and says, this is the truth. I don't think it can go that far, for reasons that you already elaborated on. But I think it can rule out certain things. For instance, physics, unless you entertain some theoretical fantasies, or two theoretical fantasies for which there is zero empirical evidence, you have to admit in physics, in foundations of physics today, that after 50 years of experimentation, we cannot say that a physical property exists before measurement. So whatever it is that we measure, it cannot be physically characterized, because all physical characterizations emerge upon measurement. Well, that rules out physical realism and therefore physicalism. But of course, even then, people will not really leave their preferred bone. They will stick to it. They will start pointing to things like Bohmian mechanics, which has no relativistic extension, which does not account for particle interactions because it doesn't have a field model of particles, and a million reasons why it shouldn't even be considered. But now people will still point to that. And it's not only in philosophy, in physics itself, you have the string theorists, you have the loop quantum gravity people. There's some new far out stuff coming up now based on purely abstract set theory. But in science, the track record has been better. We have discarded a great many things based on empirical evidence. So I do have this hope that insofar as empirical evidence has metaphysical implications, it can be useful. It can operate as an external arbiter that improves on this game in which we are basically defending our own prejudices in more and more sophisticated and scholarly manner, but ultimately just defending our prejudices. That illusionism is still around shows how far we can go with that game.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting is it shows, the Daniel Dennett types show what you need to accept if you're going to go physicalist about the mind, and that puts a lot of people off. So I think that we're in agreement on that. I'd like to. There's so much more that I want to talk to you about, but I suppose I I don't know if I share your optimism about the likelihood of getting consensus, or that that's what we're aiming at in philosophy or metaphysics. I think given the history of the discipline, that may be a little bit optimistic. But there we go. And sometimes you're sounding a little bit logical positivists who weren't so happy about metaphysics at all either.
But I'm definitely not a logical positivist. If I'm sounding like that, please forgive me. I think logical positivism is incredibly naive, and I have written about it even. But I don't want to throw the baby with the bathwater. Although empirical evidence is not definitive for anything metaphysical, it can be useful. It can rule out certain things.
Mhm.
It can guide our thinking. It can shift our sense of plausibility one way or the other. And if it can do that, I think we should use it. It's a tool in the toolbox. Why wouldn't we use it?
Okay, I agree with you on the plausibility thing. Okay, great. So another question in this sort of same topic about scientific evidence relating to metaphysics. So when we kind of get past the initial arguments undermining physicalism, and you start to talk about how you do understand scientific theory, you seem to come across as sort of an anti-realist or a pragmatist about scientific theory. You talk about them being convenient fictions in a nutshell, and saying they describe dials on the dashboard in some of your videos and so on, so the relationships of dials on dashboard. But then in other places, you're talking about, for example, entropy and evolutionary theory, as though they're sort of real features of the world. So I thought, a way to sort of, for me to try and think, well, how could you have sort of an anti-realist conception of what scientific theory does, but then also use it to undermine things like naive realism? But I thought a good way to come to this might be to just start with this question. Do you believe that entropy occurs? If so, where does it occur?
Entropy, in principle, is not an event. It's a measure. It's a description of a certain configuration of states in a system. I think that description does capture something relevant, even though we are still quite confused about how to get that description right. But I also think that our lack of clarity about the details, the nuances of entropy, how do we apply this concept in a completely coherent manner, which I think is not the case today. Today, entropy is defined in terms of information we humans can access. Well, but that says something about our capacity to access or collect or understand information. So there are weak points in entropy. But at the same time, there are things that are described by entropy that clearly occur. Like if you mix coffee and milk, you cannot unmix them. If you drop an egg on the floor, you cannot make the egg whole again. There is an arrow of time, at least, even if it is an illusion, we still have to account for the illusion. So I think entropy has uses, and I tried to apply the concept of entropy in my argument for an analytic idealism in a way that requires only those useful aspects and remains agnostic of the deeper details that are unresolved. But you are correct that I am an anti-realist with regard to theoretical entities. I'm not necessarily an anti-realist with regards to scientific accounts. So evolution does not postulate theoretical entities. Living beings exist. Genes exist. Mutations happen. Gamma rays can change gene configuration. There are no theoretical entities there. It's an account. And even if that account is incomplete, which, by the way, I think it is, I think it is still useful. There is something we do understand about evolution, that we understand enough to apply it as I do. What I am an anti-realist about is theoretical entities, like the force of gravity as an instantaneous force that acts at a distance. Once we thought it was a real entity. Now we know it's not. It's just the fabric of space-time. Even force-carrying particles, virtual particles in quantum field theory are theoretical entities. As far as theoretical entities are concerned, I think they are convenient fictions. In other words, nature, insofar as we can discern, behaves as though those entities existed. Whether they actually exist or not is irrelevant from a scientific point of view, because science is about making predictions about what we will see next in nature, right? So if nature behaves as though the entities were true, scientifically speaking, that's okay. We get rid of a convenient fiction once it can no longer predict the nuance of observation that we now develop. So now, for instance, we will eventually have to part with the theoretical entity called the fabric of space-time, because it appears that at least time can be reduced, perhaps space too, if you listen to Liz Molin. And now we start to get into hyperdimensional abstract geometry as something that is fundamental, which is music to the idealist's ears, because that means is that there is cognitive structure in nature, and that's all there is. Everything else is just a play of experience. So that's what I'm skeptical of. I'm skeptical of realism about theoretical entities. I think it's naive.
Yeah, but okay. So this is where I guess my concern would play out. So, for example, you use the idea of entropy to argue that we don't have a transparent window into the world, right? So the idea is that if entropy were occurring on the screen of perception, if our perceptions are we would dissolve. I mean, there are a few different things that I didn't understand how that relates to Friston's work, but we could maybe leave that. I don't know. But I guess I was thinking that, well, under analytic idealism, the only way I can make sense of entropy is, as you've talked about, it's what happens when I mix coffee and milk together. In other words, it's a feature of my perceptions. It's something that happens on the dashboard. But if that's the case, why would that undermine the idea that the world that I see is the world that actually is, the transparent window?
Things on the dashboard are modulated by the noumenal, right? By the real states of the world. So the dashboard isn't the world, but it does convey useful information about the world. And as far as we can discern on the dashboard, our body has an upper bound to its internal entropy, because our structure is dynamically maintained. We still have a skeleton, we still have organ systems. They don't start mixing with one another. They don't start changing in ways that are incompatible with life. So there is an upper limit to the variation of states of an organism as it appears on the dashboard. So now I'm just talking about the dashboard language. And of course, what appears on the dashboard does have some useful and true correspondence with the real states of the world. If you were to see my body sliced in half, that would correspond to something very drastic happening in my inner world, right? So the dashboard does convey useful information, and part of it is this information that the internal entropy of living organisms is always limited. It has an upper bound maintained by metabolism. We burn ATP, we use calories in order to maintain that structural and dynamical integrity, which would be incompatible with our internal entropy having no upper bound. Instead of mixing coffee and milk, if you mix your heart and your lungs, that's not compatible with life. Internal structure has to be maintained. Boundaries have to be maintained. So that's the argument. Clearly, as they appear on the dashboard, organisms have bounded internal entropy. But if perception were to mirror the states of reality, for which we cannot make that assumption, volcanoes erupt, there are tsunamis, there is no upper bound to the entropy of nature. If our internal cognitive states would mirror the states of the world, then there should be no upper bound in our internal states. Yet there obviously is.
Yeah, so I mean, I can't say I understood Friston's paper at all when I read it, but he's modeling it with a lot of mathematics, and so talking about the Markov blanket providing this sort of insulation and that probabilities are on the inside. Okay, that's about the extent that I'm going to suggest that I understood it. But if I were to interpret it seems to me a pretty sort of standard scientifically realist interpretation of that model, that our perceptual states just were brain states that were measured statistically and so on. But if that's deployed against a naive realist, so if I'm a naive realist, first of all, I don't think that my perceptual states mirror anything. I just think that my perceptual states put me in some sort of direct acquaintance with the world itself. And then I'm not sure if that was the position I was in, whether there would be any kind of entropy argument that could be deployed that would oppose the naive realist view, that wouldn't also oppose eventually analytic idealism. So sometimes you say things like, well, there must be something to do with the dashboard and the real world beyond it. But I mean, how do we know? I mean, there didn't seem to be any kind of justification for that. If I'm a naive realist, I don't buy into the dashboard reality distinction. So if entropy would be a way of making sense of my perceptions, which we're in agreement on, right? So these scientific theories help to make sense of our perceptions. So then in that case, I don't see how that would tell me that my perceptions somehow are not how things really are, because I perceive entropy, or I perceive stuff like entropic that I model that way. So can you see the concern?
Yeah. Okay. I think that's the power of the mathematical treatment that you see in the hypothesis of how does he call it, free energy principle.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
With the mathematics, you can abstract away from metaphysical hypothesis. It doesn't matter because the mathematics is neutral in that regard. All that you need to accept is that whatever we are, whatever our ontic properties or ontic status, we corresponds to internal states. The world corresponds to external states. And these two sets of states can influence one another through the intermediation of a third set of states, modeled as a Markov blanket. That's all you need. You can accept that as a physicalist, as a dualist, maybe not as a dualist. You can accept that as a monist of any sort, even neutral monism, panpsychism, cosmopsychism, idealist, physicalist, whatever. And the conclusions will hold regardless of our favorite metaphysical hypothesis. And the conclusion then that emerges from the mathematics is that our internal states are necessarily inferential. In other words, what we perceive is modulated by external states as they influence our internal states through the Markov blanket. But beyond this modulation, we are basically connecting the dots internally. We see the world that we, in fact, are modeling. Perception is largely an artifact of how we interpolate the dots of the world. And the reason for that is to put an upper bound in the entropy of the internal states. So you can, if you understand the argument and you buy into it, the argument holds whatever our metaphysical preferences or prejudices, and the argument flat out denies naive realism. So the point is to show mathematically that naive realism cannot be true. So it's not, one cannot counter that point by saying, well, but if naive idealism is true, then, well, that's the point. The point is that it cannot be. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So again, I'm not going to confess I answered the whole paper, but it seemed as though he was sort of assuming entropy and modeling the diversity you can get of entropic states in the space outside the Markov blanket. So, I mean, direct realism and disjunctivism and so on is a big position in philosophy of perception, as far as I'm aware. And I don't know if they would sort of accept the grounds from which you attack it. So that's one thing, but I mean, we could move on from that. But the other thing is, if I interpreted the Friston model the way you're suggesting, it sounds to me that I would have to assume that it's mind at large that is entropic or has these entropic states, right? Because the model would say the Markov blanket is the dashboard. And so our perceptions are simplified versions, they're inferential versions, because otherwise there would be the transmission of entropy through to inside the Markov blanket, which would cause what you colorfully described as we would dissolve into an entropic soup, right? Our organs would mix. So I mean, there are so many different things here that I still don't see how they work. So one is that it seems to mean that you'd have to say that whatever entropy is, whatever the mathematics of entropy it represent, that's what's going on in mind at large. Maybe you accept that. Secondly, it seems as though whatever's inside the Markov blanket that I am modeling isn't my mind, but is my body, because it's that would dissolve into an entropic soup. Whereas I would thought my body would also just be something on the Markov blanket.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to begin with the idea I had in the beginning of your question, but now the latest thing you said is in my mind. So I'll start from the latest.
Okay.
Under analytic idealism, the body is in the mind because it's a representation produced by our minds of something that in some sense corresponds to us, right? It's the mirror image of our mind, how our mind represents itself to itself. So from that perspective, the dynamics of the body do correspond, at least partly, to the dynamics of the mind, because it's the mind's representation of itself. When a pilot uses the dashboard, the pilot does take the dashboard seriously, otherwise he would crash the plane, right? The dashboard is not the sky, but it is a sort of a proxy for the sky. And in the case of ourselves, we only have two ways to access our own nature. One is the direct one, as per Schopenhauer, which is introspection, and the other is more objective, less susceptible to the mind's tendency to self-deceive. And that's the body, because the body is our own mind's representation of itself and of others. We see other minds in the form of bodies. Bodies are how other minds appear to our observation. So I think it is valid to make inferences about mental dynamics based on bodily dynamics. That's what neuroscience does. Neuroscience of consciousness is all about this. It's about studying the dynamics of brain activity, and complexes, and making inferences about what that means to the patient. Is the patient vegetative, or is the patient experiencing locked-in syndrome? What is the patient thinking about? What is the patient feeling? And this all works. So I think the body is a valid representation of the mind, and we can derive conclusions about the mind from it. Now, and that's the first point I wanted to make, the status of entropy in physics is very nebulous, because once we start really looking deep into what it means, what the second law of thermodynamics means, we realize that it's not simple at all, that our vulgar notion of what high entropy means is grounded on our ability to access information. It's not fundamental. So one way to go about it is to stop talking about entropy, because if you read Fristen's paper, well, there are many, but in the papers about this, he actually uses the word dispersion as opposed to entropy. And it's smart of him to do that, because by using that word, he is sticking to the part of the concept of entropy that's pretty clear already. We understand what a dispersion of states mean. Coffee and milk mixed together is a more dispersive state than if you put a division in your cup and coffee on one side and milk on the other. So dispersion, the degree of dispersion of states is a more reliable, more solid concept. And it's actually the one he uses. It's just that you can fold it into the concept of entropy, which I do, but it's not as rigorous as what he actually wrote. The dispersion of our inner states has to have an upper bound. Otherwise, there would be no seemingly persisting self. So forget the body, even mind itself, we still think we were our 5-year-old selves. So there cannot be a total dispersion of states, or there would be no continuity of identity, no continuity of personality traits, dispositions. There has to be an upper bound in the dispersion of states, whatever the ontic kind of states it is that we are talking about, whether they are physical or mental or physical-mental, like the panpsychist would say.
Okay, so but that to me just shifts to a different kind of concern. So it would mean then that you're saying that I should interpret this model where still the Markov blanket is the interface between, presumably under analytic idealism. I mean, first, I still don't see how that would be a naive realist would be troubled by it. But let's not worry about that right now. Let's just think about how it works with analytic idealism. So you'd have the Markov blanket we're interpreting as the dashboard. We're interpreting inside the Markov blanket as our dissociated alters, as ourselves as dissociated alters. And we can only have a certain degree of dispersion. So the dashboard protects us from the dispersion by only providing sort of inferential, probabilistic sort of representations. So where the dispersion is still seems to be in mind at large. So is mind at large highly dispersed? If so, how is it a mind? How is it kind of seemingly later on a kind of not even metaconscious mind? It seems to be. I mean, do we have this idea of mind at large being a mind with highly dispersed states?
Yeah. Yeah, I think mind at large is not metaconscious. Otherwise, a bacterium would be metaconscious. An archaeum would be metaconscious, right? It would be something right there at the foundational level. And we had to evolve for 4 billion years on this planet at great cost of blood to develop metacognitive awareness. So, yeah, I don't think mind at large resembles the inner life of mind at large. I don't think resembles even remotely the inner life of a human being. Our minds evolved in the context of a planetary ecosystem with limited resources. Mind at large didn't. It's the sum total of what is out there beyond life. So I think it is eminently coherent to think of the inner state of mind at large as not unified like ours, as a state with high dispersion. And you can ground that intuition conceptually or experientially. Both work. You can ground it conceptually, for instance, in integrated information theory, Giulio Tononi's concept of what he calls ontic dust, which is basically gazillions of tiny little mental complexes that don't coagulate, don't form a hi-fi complex, but they're still mental. That's one of the best conceptual illustrations or accounts or models of a highly dispersed mental state. It's ontological dust, as per Giulio Tononi. Experientially, if you take a dissociative drug or a deliriant, or if you have high fever, you can start grasping what a high dispersion state is. And it's interesting because in the case of high fever, that's exactly a high entropy state, right? Your body temperature is more elevated than is compatible with life. That's why a fever can kill you. And in a high fever state, you have delirium. Delirium is a very dispersed mental state. There is no unifying thread. It's all over the place. It's incoherent. I have had a state of delirium once. I don't remember it very well, but I remember the feeling of not knowing how to wrap it around a nice packaging and explaining and showing it to you, because it's sort of all over the place, which is a high dispersion state. So yeah, I'll leave it at that.
So, okay, so mind at large then would be highly dispersed.
It's mental content, not its subjectivity.
Okay, so the theory you talked about with this sort of mental dust stuff, that's not a pluralist sort of deconstructed kind of mind. There's still a unity there of subjectivity.
Yeah, that would be now a metaphysical interpretation of integrated information theory. So I'm not going to attribute this part now to Giulio or Christoph. This is now my interpretation. Okay. I would follow Ite Shani in the concept of core subjectivity. Core subjectivity is then the dative of experience, that to which experience is given. Schopenhauer characterized it as the one eye of the world that looks out from every creature. Eye in the sense of your eyes, but in English it has a very nice double meaning, because it can be the one I, the one me of the world that looks out from every creature. In other words, the one subject that there is, and which is behind your eyes and behind mine. So that subjectivity, which you could visualize physically as space itself, as a field that spans all space, like quantum fields do, that's unified. But its patterns of excitation, in other words, its experiential states, just like in quantum field theory, you can have localized patterns of excitation that have spatial boundaries, and you can point at them and give them physical properties and say, here is an electron, here is a muon, here is, I don't know, a gluon, whatever. The same would apply to experience in this visualization. Particular experiences would be localized patterns of excitation in this one unified subjectivity. But these localized experiential states wouldn't come together through cognitive associations to form reentrant loops. In other words, they don't form an ego, a unified experience like human consciousness is. It would be a dispersed set of experiential states, not mutually coherent, not mutually evocative, bit all over the place, but all of them experienced by one subjectivity, because they all are patterns of excitation of the one field. In other words, it's one core subject, as per Ite Shani, one dative of experience, but the experience that is given to the dative of experience is itself fragmented. It doesn't cohere in the form of hi-fi complexes, as per IIT.
Okay, so I can't really comment on the science of that. I'll take your word for that and defer to you in all things scientific. So in that, I suppose the more I'm grasping that, the less I sort of can understand what it is like to be the universe. And I understand that that's probably fine. I mean, I'm an absolute idealist. I don't know what it's like to be the absolute. That's fine. But it does seem an unintuitive way to think about mind at large, because at least on the surface, it suggests, well, we'll get to the evolutionary stuff and time stuff later. But it seems as though I would have to then imagine that mind at large is going through a process of increased dispersion through time. And that seems to be quite opposite to what I think of a mind. Mind tends to be kind of, if I think about myself, I think I had slightly more dispersed thoughts and emotions as I was younger, and I'm getting older, and I'm sort of, things are cohering a little bit better. So it seems as though, I guess I'm surprised to hear, although I assumed you'd have to say that whatever the entropic modeling is going on in mind at large, because it wouldn't make any sense for it to be on the dashboard. But that's a very unusual view of mind, it seems to me. Especially as if it were happening to us, we would dissolve.
Yeah, I don't sympathize with attempts to anthropomorphize what it is like to be mind at large, because conceptually and theoretically, it's preposterous to me. Why would the mind of a bipedal ape that has been running around a rock for 300,000 years at best, why would that mind give us any commensurable idea of what it is like to be the mind of the universe? I think that it's preposterous. I don't think we can visualize what it is. So I think we are on very, very solid grounds if we say we cannot project our own mentation onto the mentation of nature, because we have every reason to think otherwise, to think that they would be quite different. One evolved in the context of a planetary ecosystem, the other didn't. And also the scales are important insofar as, and again, IIT, insofar as a unified sense of self, the narrative self, insofar as that demands a hi-fi complex. In other words, integrated information. It requires reentrant loops of information integration. At the scale of a brain, that's perfectly possible. Even though brain signals are very slow, because they require release of neurotransmitters across every single synaptic cleft, which is a very slow process. So a thought takes on the order of hundreds of milliseconds, which is very slow. Even then, it's incredibly fast compared to the speed with which information could be integrated in the form of reentrant loops at the scale of the universe. Actually, they wouldn't be able, it's not possible for information to be integrated at the scale of the universe, because the universe is expanding faster than the speed of light would allow for this integrated information to emerge at the largest scales. It can only happen at fairly localized scales in which the speed of light is overwhelms everything else, including uh, uh, yeah, dark energy, the cosmological constant. Um, Now, even though we should not anthropomorphize what it is like to be mind at large, can we make good theoretical guesses? I think we can. We surely can, and I think it is the best theory we have to guide that guesswork. It's a calibrated theory. It's calibrated based on subjective reports on the one hand and objective measurements of brain function and brain metabolism on the other. We can then extrapolate that calibrated model to things that are not reporting experience and make a more or less good guess about what it is like to be them. I think there is only one object that is not alive and yet has a consciousness of its own, and that's the entirety of the inanimate universe, the blob, as some philosophers have called it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there are very good physical and analytical grounds for concluding that. It's a best guess, like everything in philosophy, but it's a very good best guess, and that's what we should run with. We should not try to empathize with what it is like to be mind at large, because it would be preposterous if it had anything to do with what it is like to be us, right?
Yeah. Well, okay. So, a couple of questions that I'll say here that I think are probably best addressed in a different topic. But one reason would be that first of all, for the idealist thesis to be meaningful, we have to have some kind of conception of the kind of thing we're predicating of reality by calling it mind rather than calling it something else. So yeah. The more we have to say, yeah, but nothing like mind to be, then our grip on what that means seems to be loosened a little bit. And the other thing was, here's a reason why you might think mind at large should be something like our mind, and that's that we're alters of it.
Okay, let me start with the first. I think the only thing we need to grant for at least analytic idealism to hold, is that the states of mind at large, whatever they are like from a first-person perspective, whatever it is like to be mind at large, whether we can visualize that or sympathize with that or empathize with that or not, it doesn't matter. The one thing we need is that they be experiential states. In other words, that they be qualitative in essence, that their essence, their first-person view, entail qualities and not just numbers. Mm-hmm. So that's what we need. It's the only conclusion that we need. We do not need to know what it is like to be it. All we need to know is that there is something it is like to be it. So that's the key difference. The argument I just made is that we cannot know what it is like to be it. But I think we can, on very solid grounds, infer that there is something it is like to be it. So that's the first part of the question you asked. The second one I forgot. Can you?
Oh, you said we have no reason. That it would be totally groundless to assume that mind at large was anything like our mind. And I said, well,
oh yeah.
We're dissociated alters of it. So
yeah. I think the subjectivity, or the core subjectivity, as per Ite's definition, the core subjectivity that underlies my alter is the same core subjectivity that underlies you and underlies the universe at large. In other words, there are eyes to experience. There is a subject that experiences. And that subject is identical in me and you if we remove particular experiences from this picture. In other words, if we imagine that we suddenly become completely amnesic while lying in an ideal, perfect sensory deprivation chamber, you have no contents of consciousness, but there is still a subject there. And that subject is identical in all of us, not only identical in the sense of being an identical copy, not that, but identical in the sense of being the exact same subjectivity. So that we can extrapolate. That's the move Schopenhauer made. exactly the move Schopenhauer made. He denied that the will in us is anything like the will out there. But he emphasized this commonality of subjectivity in the form of the one eye of the world that looks out from every creature. Now, the outer idea, it's a metaphor. It's a metaphor with clinical dissociation, like dissociative identity disorder. And as every metaphor, it's very useful in some senses, but we shouldn't run too far with it because then we break that commonality. I think where we break the commonality is this. Every dissociated alter of a human mind is still human. So you can infer what it is like to be the host personality from the point of view of an alter. But I don't think the same applies for an alter of the universe and what it is like to be mind at large, because the scales are so vastly different. The function is so vastly different. The history is so vastly different. I think we have very, very little, precious little, that we can, solid ground to stand on when we try to infer what it is like to be that. I think the only solid ground we have, again, is to say, I don't know what it is, but there is something it is like to be that. That's where we have solid ground, I think.
Okay,
it's
all right.
Probably an irritatingly cautious view, but yeah.
Well, but I mean, it's a far more fleshed out view than the one that maybe it's in the idea of the world, but it's far more fleshed out than the one that I was encountering in your books and in your videos previously. So it's been really helpful to have you. I mean, I don't know if people have been asking you these questions before. Maybe it's giving you an opportunity to voice them. But
no, there is a large degree of difference in sophistication between talking to you and most podcast interviews.
Oh, well, I take that very kindly as a really good compliment. And maybe I'll edit a little clip out of that and make it a short. But so it seems to me then that, just to sort of wrap this up then, so I should be thinking about mind at large as a mind that I have only a very tenuous grip on what it's like. It's going to be, it's the mental contents, the mental states of it are highly dispersed and presumably becoming increasingly dispersed as time goes on, however that's understood.
That's something you brought up before, and I forgot to comment on it. Well, according to the second law of thermodynamics, yes, dispersion is increasing. Yet, historically, precisely the opposite has happened, which is accepted by physics as well. There was a break in symmetry very shortly after the Big Bang. In principle, the universe should be a completely uniform distribution of energy. In other words, a blank white canvas with nothing going on. That's not what happened. And the reason for that is twofold: quantum fluctuations and gravity. Quantum fluctuations, as the name implies, entail statistical fluctuations. So, as far as we know, by mere chance, in some parts of the early universe, energy or mass concentrated a little bit more. And gravity then kicks in and amplifies that, because the more mass concentrates, the more it pulls more mass and concentrates mass even more. So, from the Big Bang to the cosmic web of galaxies and galaxy clusters, there has been a tremendous increase in structure, which seems to contradict the second law of thermodynamics, right? It doesn't, but you have to jump through theoretical hoops to make sense of that. But the point I'm trying to make is that this is precisely where the doubt about our idea of entropy kicks in. It's not about the concept of dispersion itself, which is clear, but about the notion that dispersion always increases. In other words, the second law of thermodynamics. This is highly doubtful, because here we are projecting our ability to access and make sense of information. And while the cosmological history of the universe clearly shows that structure has increased, and we project that it will decrease, but between the beginning and now, it's a fabulous increase in structure. So I think the jury is still out whether mind at large is actually becoming more dispersed. If you stick to Big Bang physics, which we may drop, we may actually drop. It's becoming more and more likely. But if you stick to it, you ought to accept that from 13.8 billion years ago to today, there has been an unfathomable increase in structure, an unfathomable reduction in dispersion. 10 to the minus 32 after the Big Bang, there was a lot of dispersion. And then inflation kicked in, quantum fluctuations, gravity. Something happened there that created all this structure of the galaxy web, the web of galaxies, which look like a brain, by the way. And we don't quite know why that is the case. I think that's what I would take home with me and leave the status of the second law of thermodynamics for further discussion, because a lot of physicists are questioning that now.
Okay, so we'll leave that. But what we do take on then, which I think is going to be relevant to questions that are going to further down my list, is that we should think mind at large has states that are highly dispersed, such that the dashboard has to represent them in a simplified way so that that dispersion doesn't ruin our party, whatever yes. our current sort of kind of mind. So mind at large is something very, very different. Okay. So we'll move on to a question that's unfortunately still in the same topic. I was just going to read two quotes to you that seem to be in tension. They're not outright contradictory, but and maybe some of what you said helps here, but I thought you could clear it up. So early on in Nutshell on page 19, you say, we have every reason to believe that the real states of the world, which are external to and independent of our perceptual representations, are non-physical. And then this is the important quote, in the sense of not being amenable to description by physical quantities. After all, the latter were created to describe physical states, not real ones. So describe things in the dashboard. Then near the end of the book, on page 130, you say, now these real mental states of mind at large can be represented on a dashboard as physical states, colors, sounds, smells, flavors, and textures. These representational physical states, in turn, can be described through physical quantities, but physical quantities are invented precisely to describe them. Physical models nature through physical quantities. Therefore, it describes and predicts the behavior of the dials on the dashboard. But since the dials are constructed so to convey salient information about the world outside, indirectly, physics models the world. It describes and predicts the states of nature through the intermediation of their representations on the dashboard of dials. So in the first quote, you say, reality is not amenable to description by physical quantities. Mm-hmm. In the second one, you say that physics models the world through the intermediation of the representations on the dials. So again, and I suppose this sort of links in again with this same Friston modeling, that it was very statistical, very quantitative, and yet that was being used to model mind at large, dispersion in mind at large.
In this particular, the latter case that we're discussing now, I think it's simpler than that. I don't think the real states of the world, as they are, can be described by physical quantities. But the imprint they leave on the dashboard can. And because the dashboard conveys information about the real states of the world, we can indirectly describe the world if we describe the dashboard. In other words, imagine the dashboard on an airplane, and there are these little dials moving along a scale, left and right. You cannot describe wind or the shapes of clouds or the distribution of rain droplets using the scale of the dials. You cannot describe them. Yet they convey information about wind, humidity distribution in the air pressure. So if you describe the movement of the dials, you will be indirectly describing something that is true about the clouds, the rain, and all that. But you cannot apply the quantities, the scales of the dials to the clouds, the wind, and the rain. They are incommensurable. You see, that's what I meant. I don't think there is a contradiction there, at least not in spirit. I don't think there is a contradiction in there. Where you can certainly make a valid criticism is this. Physics cannot be complete because since the dashboard reduces the dispersion of states, it's necessarily filtering things out. which a dashboard does. Why? Because the pilot doesn't need to have in the flight manual an answer about how to react to every specific shape of cloud. It's unnecessary. You don't need to know the specific shapes of clouds. All you need to know is some statistical averages, some summations, some useful representations of what is salient. And that's what the dashboard gives you. So the dashboard, because it does represent the real states of the world, it conveys information, useful information about the world. If we describe the dashboard, we are indirectly saying something valid about the world. But because the dashboard filters out dispersion, it gives us a sort of digested, maybe statistically averaged or whatever, a filtered out version. Our description will never be complete. We will never be able to describe specific cloud shapes. We will miss on nuance. We'll miss on subtlety because we don't need that to survive. Therefore, we didn't evolve a cognitive representation of all that's going on. So the spirit of what I'm trying to say is that physics is valid, because if it sticks rigorously to the dynamics of the dashboard, it will make good inferences about what nature would do next. And we only have access to what nature would do next via the dashboard anyway. So all we can do is to predict what the dials will do next.
Yeah.
And which is all we need, right? Ultimately.
So there's two questions on this one. So one is that, I'll ask a clarificatory question first, because I think it's going to relate to what comes next. The clarification is this. When you've listed your physical states, you said colors, sounds, smells, flavors, and textures. You haven't said some of the other Lockean ones of quantity, for example. I'm thinking of particular, number.
What?
Number.
Yeah.
Like number is a prime. So you've purely listed qualitative features. Do you think that the dashboard is purely qualitative? It has no quantities on it, and the quantities only emerge when we start to use physical theories or theories to talk about it? Or do you think when you talk about dials, the dials quantitative, or is it just they're just sort of?
I think quantities as we understand them, meters, seconds, joules, coulombs, electron volts, these are our descriptions of the qualities that appear on the dashboard, our cognitive dashboard. Just quickly change the view because I see you very small now. I don't think these quantities, these descriptions that we came up with as bipedal apes, exist as some kind of Platonic entity in mind at large. I think these are our own evolved tools for predicting what nature would do next, describing and predicting what nature would do next. So the existing us. And I talk about the five senses, and because these are the five sensors we have. Like an airplane has airspeed sensors, air pressure sensors. We have retinas, eardrums, outer surface of the skin, lining of the nose, and papilla in the tongue. Having said that, I think because it's all one field of subjectivity under analytic idealism, it's all one core subjectivity, one dative of experience. I think the notion of archetypes, the Jungian notion of archetypes, which I think does carry validity, the same archetypes that express themselves in us in the forms of numbers are also latent in mind at large. They ought to be, because it's one field of subjectivity. It's the only thing that exists. It's the only thing there is. And to be is to have properties. In the case of mind, we call these properties archetypes. They are mental properties. So archetypes is just another name for properties, but zoomed into and specific for mental dispositions, predispositions. So it is conceivable that something akin to our qualities also emerges instinctively in mind at large. But it would be dispersed, not metacognitive, instinctive, not deliberate, not well organized, like we organize these archetypal expressions in us. So I think it's too much anthropomorphizing to think of the Platonic forms out there as the specific expression of the archetypes in us.
Yeah.
There is something like that out there, but I wouldn't even begin to guess what it is like.
Okay. Right. I know nothing about Jung, so I can't really comment on that. But you may have ruined some of my later questions with that, or at least pre-answered them. We'll see. Okay, so I guess then for me, and we'll move on from this. I mean, you can of course make a final comment on it. It seems to me then that you've got to walk a certain line where, on the one hand, you are using mathematics to model the states of mind at large, with the Friston analogy. So you have to apply mathematical quantitative theories to mind at large, so that you can argue that we actually need something beyond the dashboard. So we have to argue that the dashboard isn't it, the physical world isn't it, there's something beyond, and then remove the right to directly apply mathematical quantitative theory to anything beyond the dashboard. I guess I don't think it's contradictory. I don't think there's a flat out, this cannot work. But it feels a little bit having your cake and eating it.
I think I understand you. So I'll, insofar as I can help, I'll try to help. Insofar as you even need help, I don't know, but I'll try to express my perspective on this. As I mentioned, there is a physicist called Eugene Wigner. He wrote a paper in 1960 about the miracle of the effectiveness of mathematics for describing nature. And he uses the word miracle a number of times, a dozen times in his paper. And the reason is that mathematics, as Russell and Whitehead tried to prove in the Principia, should be grounded in logic. Well, it turns out we cannot ground it completely in logic because of Gödel's theorem, incompleteness and all that. But people say, well, it's a failed attempt.
I did my PhD on Frege,
and
I know all about
there you go.
I know all about
it
Russell's
was a
paradox.
Largely successful attempt. It
Amazing.
just wasn't completely successful.
Exactly. I feel so sorry for him.
But anyway,
sorry.
Then the question that arises is if mathematics is grounded in logic, and logic is axiomatic, it starts from what we, monkeys, consider to be self-evident truths, then why would nature comply with what the monkeys think to be self-evident? It's discombobulating. That's why Wigner uses the word miracle so often in the paper. Why would our cognitive prejudices built into our physiology happen to be largely applicable to what nature is actually doing? Why does nature comply with our logic? Because it complies with our mathematics. Physics predicts nature through mathematical equations with exquisite precision.
But now you're sounding like the kind of idealists that I read who are making a priori arguments, but for idealism.
I'm trying to make an in-principle argument, but not one that gives you a direct truth, but one that opens up a door for inferring things. So let me be explicit about what I mean by this. What I mean by this is that under idealism, Wigner's miracle is not a miracle at all. It's completely expectable. Yeah. Because to be is to have properties. We call mental properties archetypes. If there is only one mind and we are part of it, then the same archetypes are immanent in us as they are immanent in the rest of nature. So the logic of nature is the logic in us, archetypally. Before we start constructing theories, the groundwork, the axiomatic groundwork, the things that are self-evident, our sense of what is self-evident, like if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, or that everything should be either true or false, not both, not neither. Well, this particular one, the principle of excluded middle, this one is up for grabs. This one is, nature may not really comply with this one, but it complies with the other four axioms of Aristotelian logic, at least. Why does that correspondence happen? Well, because it's the same archetypes immanent on both sides. So I think this favors idealism in the sense that idealism makes this plausible and understandable, and under physicalism, it's a miracle, like Wigner said. Now, I wouldn't, however, go as far as to say that the specific expressions of these archetypes in our theoretical imagination exist in the theoretical imagination of mind at large. I don't even think mind at large has a theoretical imagination because that requires some form of metacognition. You need to recognize yourself as a theory making subject in some sense, um, apart from the subject of your theory, which I don't think mind at large can do. So when I say I don't think numbers exist as Platonic forms out there, number systems are a particular expression of logical archetypes in human beings. Um, so I don't think they necessarily exist out there. But the archetypes that ground the logic underneath number systems, I do think they are immanent out there too.
You're so close to the kind of idealist that would posit a sort of a logos or some kind of logical principle in reality that we're in touch with. Because when you started off answering, I think it may have been this question or previous question, and you were saying how you think sort of quantities emerge in our mind through evolution. The Frege in me wanted to jump out and smash the screen and say, that's psychologism, that's just utter nonsense. How could you have mathematical truths in such cases and so on? But then you sort of correlated it in some relatively mysterious way through these archetypes to something going on in mind at large, but then don't want to predicate it properly. And so I think, what I get to the end of your books and I just think, but mind at large has to be at least something metacognitive or more than it's highly dispersed. It's sort of far more complex than our mind. I've now got that it's got something like mathematics going on in there. So we'll see where we end up. I just got
very briefly, just to comment very briefly on that. Basic logic intuition about what is self-evident, that doesn't require metacognition. It's a very low-level mental function. It's very instinctive, very spontaneous. It requires no argumentation, no sophistication, no model building, no conceptual narratives. It's just felt.
Right. So this is like the child that, like, if I tell my son, you're going to get ice cream later, and then I don't give it to him, and I say, well, I said you're going to get ice cream later, but I didn't say you weren't not going to not get ice cream later. So they kind of have this. They understand the law of contradiction without having to sit in a logic class, right? This sort of Leibniz idea, right, about the innate logic being innate to us. But
yeah, I mean, in this particular case, contradiction is the law of excluded middle. And that one has been shot through several times by philosophers as well. The whole, well, we know what that discussion has been.
I'll try it on him next time.
It's been going on since at least the early 70s, this discussion about the law of excluded middle. So the jury is out on that one, but the other four, I think, are on safe ground.
But what I mean is you still got, I suppose I can see that you could imagine a mind operating according to the principles of logic without knowing what it was doing, without that metacognitive reflection on recognizing that it was deploying such laws.
Yes, that's what I think.
All right. Put a pin in that one, and we'll move on. We'll see if it goes. So here's the last one in this section, and well done for your stamina. So there was one other place in page 16 where you said, even our language and our very thoughts have evolved to speak dashboard and not reality. I can see how that follows with your regular commitment to an evolutionary account of things, but it seems. Isn't that the death knell of metaphysics, including your own? Because it seems to mean then that your metaphysical view, if true, should be unthinkable and unsayable.
I mean, this has been the theme of our discussion from the beginning. I don't think we as humans can make definitive pronouncements. I think we are in the game of making the least bad guess. We are in the business of trying to improve on our own mistakes. So the spirit of my metaphysics is, well, I'm trying to be less wrong than the competition. I'm trying to be less wrong than the ridiculous mainstream narrative we have today, which is completely implausible and even self-contradictory. So in that spirit, since I'm not trying to find absolutes, then it's not really a contradiction. I am a monkey sitting on a rock that's zipping around space, and I'm like, what am I to know anything? I'll at least try to be better than I was yesterday. That's the spirit. You see what I mean?
Yeah. So everything you think and say, you've evolved to be dashboard directed. So this
Yeah,
is,
and we can, I think we, even as monkeys, we can understand that the dashboard is a representation and not the sky. And we can construct reasonable inferences from that understanding, which is what analytic idealism is about. It's trying to come up with the most reasonable inferences based on what we can observe in our cognitive capacity. But I don't think that analytic idealism or any metaphysics will, for as long as we are just humans, deserve the characterization of an absolute metaphysics.
yeah.
Totally true.
So I get that, and I agree with that.
I don't believe in syllogisms, for instance, which is the attempt to, through mere cognition, get at the absolute ground of reality. I don't believe in that. I think even our logic, even some logic axioms are up for grabs.
Okay, yeah. So I accept that view. However, um, I don't have a well beyond the dashboard equivalent that you have, which is, I suppose, what your metaphysics is aimed at. So it seems to me that there could be the kind of problems that. So when the analytic philosopher in me wants to say, well, then how are you even capable of referring to something? If your thoughts and your words have evolved, if you're gaining all semantic content of your claims, including the content of your thoughts from the dashboard, is it even in principle possible to refer to something beyond that? It'd be a similar way to the way the neo-Kantians just sort of rejected the noumenal world as being epistemically unavailable, so effectively non-existent.
Yeah, I think it is, and in a way different from Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's move, he came shortly after Kant, early in the 19th century, and he said, well, Kant said the noumenal is unreachable. You cannot access it. It's permanently and definitively beyond reach. Only the phenomena, only the appearances, only the dashboard is reachable. And Schopenhauer said, well, there is one exception to this. We cannot access how things are in themselves with the exception of ourselves, because we are also something, and we can directly access what it is to be us. I don't know what it is to be the moon, but I know what it is to be me. And since my noumenal, whatever it is, appears to observation as my very material body, which is made of the same atoms and fields, or the same mass, as Schopenhauer said, as the rest of the universe, I can reasonably infer that what I find in me when I introspect is of the same kind as the noumenal out there, which also appears to me in the form of the same atoms and fields that constitute my body. So that's one avenue to say, well, we can try to reach out through introspection. Another avenue, which is my own, because I'm not very good at spiritual introspection. I'm too hard-headed here. It's very difficult to shift my, normal state of consciousness. I'm very locked into my prefrontal cortex.
Cerebral.
Yeah. Um, even through that, even through reasoning, yes, we are monkeys, but even monkeys at some point can realize that they're looking at a dashboard. Why? Because we have analogies. We know that airplanes also move in the world. They also have sensors to collect information about the world. And that information is better encoded in an inferential manner in the form of dials that look nothing like the world. And well, we also move in the world. We also have sensors that collect information about the world. Why would we, contrary to the airplane, present that information to ourselves as mirror states, as opposed to whatever way makes more sense for the game of survival, which is Donald Hoffman's well substantiated theory. It's even a mathematical theorem derived from game theory that we would not have evolved to perceive the world as it is. We would have evolved to have a dashboard that allows for prompt responses to environmental challenges and opportunities. So I think even we as monkeys can do better than naive realism. Of course, the dashboard is a metaphor, and as every metaphor, it has limitations, and it's not the complete truth. But I think it is a small step forward. That I think we can infer. Yeah.
I wonder if the reference problem could be solved similarly if you can refer, if you can get the reference to mental states through your own introspective reference, you may be able to project that or extrapolate that out.
Well, even superficial introspection gives us some very good clues. For instance, we think today as a culture that in principle everything is a physical state. And physical states are defined in terms of quantities. In other words, if you provide a long enough list of the right numbers, you will have said everything there is to say about the physical state. You just give the mass, energy, momentum distribution across every coordinate of space-time, and you will have said everything there is to say. Mm-hmm. But we have direct access to states that cannot be fully characterized, exhaustively characterized through numbers alone. What it is like to fall in love. Give me a list of numbers that tells me everything there is to say about what it is like to fall in love, or even to taste strawberry or sing red. That's the Mary problem, so well known in philosophy of mind. Yeah. So I think even superficial introspection, just think about your emotions, think about your thoughts. Are they physical states in the sense that they can be fully characterizable through numbers? No, obviously they aren't. What is the length of my thought in meters? What is the energy of my emotion in coulombs or joules, right? We can't do that. So introspection gives us direct access to a proof of existence. There are states that exist in nature which are not characterizable through physical quantities. So if physical quantities describe the dashboard, and what is behind the dashboard is then by definition not physical, because physicality is what appears on the dashboard, what could it be? Well, we at least have one option that we know to exist as a hypothesis, which is mental states. They fulfill all the criteria. And that's Schopenhauer's move. You access mental states here. These mental states here appear as a very material body. The world appears as the same matter, same atoms, force fields, everything. So what is behind those representations is of the same kind as what is behind my body, which is mental states. I think this is all eminently reasonable. Even monkeys can do this.
Yeah, and I suppose it would make sense of why things like metaphysics and religion happen after in metaconscious, because you can only sort of reflect on these sorts of more personal things and objectify, make them as objects of contemplation in the process. Okay, great. Let's move on to the next topic. So I think that was really helpful. So this is one where I, again, was wanted to sort of draw up what I thought could be criticisms of analytic idealism, not the way you've argued for it, which is what I was looking at before, sort of the empirical approach, but now what seem to be at least tensions within the model. So could you start by briefly giving us a summary of the metaphysics of analytic idealism so people know what we're talking about?
So the idea is that, like physicalism, there is a real world out there, outside our individual minds. But unlike physicalism, it infers that that external world is made of mental states, just like our own internal states are mental. They are not our mental states. To be is not to be perceived, like Berkeley said. Things have existence independent of perception, of being perceived, but that existence is mental. In the same way that my thoughts are mental, but they are outside your mind. You cannot access my thoughts directly. You cannot influence them by merely wishing them to be different. And yet they are mental. They are outside your mentation, but they are mental. So in my view, the world is made of these external mental states. And what we call physicality, colloquially, in other words, the contents of the screen of perception, the things we see, touch, taste, smell. Physicality, the qualities of physicality on the screen of perception are our internal representations upon observation, upon measurement of the mental states of the world. So the redness of an apple that you perceive exists only in you. But there is a mental state out there that modulates your perception to create the redness that you perceive. In other words, the redness of an apple is a dial on your dashboard. It exists only to you, but the movement of that dial is modulated by an actual state of the sky outside that you're picking up through your sensors, through your eyes, through your ears. So to be is not to be perceived, but insofar as we say that does the moon exist when nobody's looking? And by moon, I mean that silver shiny disk in the night sky. Then the answer is no, because the silver shiny disk is a dashboard indication. And if you don't measure, the dashboard shows nothing. But the thing that would appear to you as the shiny disk in the sky, that thing exists whether you're looking at it or not. So physicality is private, but I endorse some form of realism. There is a real world out there. It's just not physical because physicality is representation. And the boundary between us and that external world is given by a process of akin to dissociation. In other words, it's all one mental web of cognition, but some of the associative links can break and create a dissociative complex, a mind separate from its cognitive surroundings. And what that dissociation looks like when we represent it on a dashboard is biology, metabolism, a body, a living body. And that's what we are. Bodies are what dissociative processes in this mind of nature look like. And that's why I can't read your thoughts. Presumably you can't read mine. And I don't know what's happening in the galaxy of Andromeda right now. And that would then be the end of the dissociation.
Okay, excellent. So I think the first thing I wanted to sort of ask you on is this idea of our bodies being what our mind look like from a third person perspective. So it seems to me that typically the looking like relationship, if I'm looking at something, then how it looks is coincident with how it is. So it seems to me that if I were to interpret bodies as what mental states look like, then it suggests a kind of a non-reductive behaviourism in terms of how I'm interpreting things.
Not reductive physically. It's reductive in another sense, but not physically.
Right. Okay. So it's not trying to do the work. I know you're reducing the other direction. But I'll talk about that. But there still seems to me as though there should be a kind of a one-to-one correspondence between, or something like it, between a mental state and a bodily state. So there are a lot of issues that are raised towards these sorts of views, like behaviorism, that it seems as though I can have a mental state but not look like I have that mental state. I'm thinking of like Putnam's Super Spartans here and this sort of stuff, where you can imagine. Yeah. So I'll just say it for the sake of the viewers. I realize you know what I'm talking about. Yeah. So the behaviorist idea is that what your mental states are is just movements of your body or behaviors of your body. So that you try and say, to be happy is just to smile, to clap your hands and giggle or whatever it is, and to be sad is to change your mouth in a different kind of way. So there seems to be something like that would be a natural way of interpreting the idea that your body is what your mind looks like, or mental state looks like. But the criticisms of it are that, well, it seems at least conceivable that somebody could, like the Spartans of legend, could be having mental states and it not manifest at all. It might not look like anything from the outside. Is this a problem for your theory at all? Have you thought about it?
Yes, I don't think it is. Well, just to get the basics straight, analytic idealism does not say that your happiness is your smile.
Yeah.
It says that your smile is part of what your happiness looks like. There is no identity between the two, but there is a correspondence of information, because the image of a phenomenon does convey information about the phenomenon it is an image of, right? Flames convey information about combustion. Now, the criticism would be that image may not actually correlate with the phenomenon it is an image of, because I may behave in a deceptive way, for instance. There are two lines of answer to this. The first line is, it is the entire body there is an image, not only the surface of your body. If I put you under an fMRI and you lie, I probably will find an image that correlates with that lie, because I can see your brain activity. And it's empirically pretty established that there are very strong correlations between patterns of brain activity and inner mental life. we can even reconstruct people's dreams by reading their mental activity. You know, if you extrapolate, if you calibrate a model well enough based on subjective reports, you can even extrapolate that way. So that's the first line of argumentation. The image that I'm talking about is not just a superficial image. It is the entire pattern of your metabolism, including your patterns of brain activity. Now, the second line is the following. Unlike the sole cause of a phenomenon, the image of a phenomenon does not need to be complete. If physicalism is right, then there cannot be anything about experience and the information intrinsic in it that cannot be traced back to something in the brain, in the nervous system, in the body. Because the body is supposed to be the cause of the experience. So if you can't trace it back to the body, then you have disembodied experience, which contradicts physicalism. But under idealism, analytic idealism, the body is what the experience looks like. So it will convey useful information about the experience, but not necessarily all information about the experience. Because images don't necessarily need to be complete. Look, my image on your screen right now is a flat two-dimensional array of colorful pixels. I am not a two-dimensional figure made of little rectangular blocks, all right? So my image does convey relevant information about me to you, the image on your screen right now, but it's not complete. It doesn't say everything there is to be said about the phenomenon. So under analytic idealism, it is conceivable that there are experiences that you may not find back in the metabolism. It is conceivable. Whether that is actually the case or not, it's an empirical question. And I think on the empirical side, today, things are pointing in the direction that indeed it may not be a complete image. There are several situations, several types of situations in which a reduction or an impairment of brain function correlate with an increased richness or intensity of experience. And we haven't been able quite to account for that so far, other than to postulate a different theory for each individual case and mutually contradictory theories. So the jury is still out, but it's looking like the image is indeed not complete.
Okay, yeah. So I suppose then that the behaviorist is obviously trying to interpret mental states in terms of behavior. The mind-brain identity theorist is trying to interpret it in terms of the brain. You're not necessarily committed to one or other, but you're committed to something similar. But the incompleteness means that it wouldn't be a contradiction for you. The kinds of problems that those views have, I can see you could conceptually sidestep, right? Because on the one hand, the multiple realizability problem, which is that, you know, people have different brains. You being in a certain, what would seem to be introspectively a certain state that's similar to me, your brain might be different to me, or you could have had some reason, neuroplasticity, that has different sort of kinds of firings going on to me. So there isn't in some way in which being happy looks like simpliciter. And there wouldn't be a way in, because and then this links in with the sort of Lewisian complaint about, well, you know, we could imagine an alien with very different physiology, or I think octopuses have very different brains, but there seem to be certain kind of states they can be in that's akin to it, fear or so on.
Yeah.
Which would look so different. But I guess why does it look so different? Would be one thing, and why could so you've got the two different, if you've got the same kind of mental state can manifest very differently in between individuals and so on. Different kinds of mental states can actually manifest the same. I might be crying because I'm sad, you might be crying because you're happy. And so this looks like connection.
This is tricky territory. We cannot know whether two people that manifest different images are actually having the same mental state. We do not have direct access to their mental state to know. That's the problem of colors in philosophy of mind. You may see red, what for me is red, every time I say green, but because you consistently hear green for what you experience as red, your red is my green, and we would never be able to know that we are actually experiencing two different things, because the language equalizes it through cultural convention. Yeah. And so if the difference is consistent, it would still be there and be undetectable. Um, Now, you mentioned you can circumvent the problems attributed to behaviorism. You could analytically put it that way. I think what it would not convey properly is the notion that under analytic idealism, it is incredibly reasonable that images not be complete. Why? Because images are dashboard representations. Dashboards are our evolved cognitive constructs, and we would have evolved to represent what is salient, not what is not salient. Otherwise, if we represented everything, including what is not salient to survival, it would just impair our ability to respond promptly to environmental challenges and opportunities by overloading us with information that we cannot act upon anyway and is irrelevant anyway. So, almost by construction, you would expect that our cognitive representations would not be complete because it would be quite a fluke if everything about the world were salient for survival, right? It would be quite a fluke. It would be a statistical near impossibility that that would be the case. So we evolved the dashboard, like the airplane's dashboard was also constructed to pick out what is salient, but ignore what is not. Like if there are gamma rays, the pattern of gamma rays bombardment around the airplane, there are no sensors for that because it's not salient. You will fly safely either way. You may get cancer, but you will fly safely either way, right? So the same for us. So it's eminently reasonable that all images would be incomplete, including what other outers look like on the dashboard. And therefore, it's eminently reasonable that there are a great many things about what people experience from within that wouldn't be betrayed in how we represent that on our own dashboard. And and finally, just to highlight, I'm really definitively, I'm not neutral, I'm definitively against behaviorism. I think Skinner's black box was one of the most bizarre, stupid, incredibly silly things ever created, not only in clinical psychology, but in psychological theory as well. I think, obviously, my happiness is not my smile. My smile betrays the presence of my happiness. I think this is obvious to anyone, and any attempt to reduce the phenomenon to its image is a desperate conceptual attempt to safeguard one's metaphysical prejudices.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. When defending analytic idealism against objections from the continuation of the body under certain changes of mental states, you kind of provide different answers to two cases. Well, I should say, first of all, that I actually really appreciated the bit at the end of Analytic Idealism in a nutshell, where you try to deal with some of these concerns. I found that very helpful. But so one of them was about why our body remains when we seem to be under anesthetic or unconscious and so on. And your answer here was that, well, actually, we're not unconscious. We're still conscious. It's just that our consciousness is no longer accessible to the ego, or what I would think of as...
Anesthesiologists are arriving at the same conclusion, by the way.
Right. So no complaints there. You know, I like Bloch's idea of access consciousness and the consciousness below that and so on. Okay, great.
We are not conscious of the pain of surgery. That the drug cocktail of the anesthesia is dissociative enough that we cannot be conscious of the pain. And even if we were, they would pick it up by measuring heart rate, blood pressure, and all that. So the claim is not that we are conscious of the surgery. The claim is that we are in some mental space that we cannot recall because one of the drugs is precisely one that prevents the formation of memory pathways.
Exactly. And so the answer then is that the reason it seems to be then, the answer is that the reason you continue to perceive a body from the outside is because there is still a mind there, and that's just what the mind looks like when it's anesthetized and so on.
Yes, and it looks different. If you measure your patterns of brain activity while you are under anesthesia, they would be very different. But there's still something. Yeah, metabolism is going on. Yeah. Okay,
great. But then when there's the question of why a corpse remains after you die, you give a very different kind of answer. Here you say that a corpse is the result of a footprint, is the sort of traces of a doing of nature. So sort of the dissociation process happens, it's now finished, it's reintegrated, and there's this sort of echo. I mean, I'm using my own term, sort of like an echo. And
yes, fine too.
A corpse is what this footprint looks like. So it
Yeah.
seems to me that these are very different replies. So you could almost have. I mean, I know you've got your own scientific reasons for saying there's still consciousness going on, but you could have said in the previous case, when you sleep, if you just had a notion of consciousness that was sort of purely what we directly, obviously are aware of, are an aware consciousness, you're saying that when we sleep, it's just the footprint of our previous awareness that's visible in the bed. But you don't. But then with the corpse, you do. So it seems as though it creates a confusion in terms of asking, well, what is it that a body looks like? Is a body what an altar looks like, or is it what a doing footprint looks like? Because these seem to be different things. Are bodies
Yeah.
appearances of things, or are they appearances of traces of doings? And if you say, well, in one case, a body is what an altar looks like, in another case, it's what a doing or footprint of a doing of mind at large looks like, it seems a bit ad hoc.
Well, it's not, because these are completely different images. A sleeping body may look to us like a dead body because our vision is very coarse. We don't see any microscopic details. We have no access to what's happening inside. But if you could look at a corpse under a sufficiently magnifying microscope and a sleeping body under a sufficiently magnifying microscope, and you would scan them, you would see that they are completely different. In one case, there is an active process called metabolism, which is overwhelming. It's happening everywhere: protein folding, transcription, and there's all ATP bindings, all kinds of things. It's a hive of activity in one case. In the other case, it's not there. The activity there is related to decomposition, the breaking down of certain things. So the body asleep as an image is completely different from a corpse. It may not be different from just looking at it with your naked eyes, but under analytic idealism, it's the metabolizing body that is an image of the dissociation. So if you take metabolism out, you already changed that image immediately, very substantially. So we cannot deal with both cases as if they were the same, because empirically they're not the same at all. They're very, very, very different.
So, yeah, I mean, I understand that, of course, and there would be a difference between, if I'm watching someone dancing and I'm watching someone, you know, standing in a queue, they look very different. But the thing is that they're both what an altar looks like, doing something. They're both in some ways an appearance of a thing. It seems like, if I was going to think about the logical categories, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm an analytic philosopher, I'm going to go there sometimes. So the logical category, on the one hand, it's the body is, when alive, what a thing looks like. And then the other, it's what a verb looks like, a doing, something. There just seems to be a very different kind of category of whatever a footprint, which is something, an impression or something left behind from a thing or a doing. And yet there's similarities enough between a corpse and a living body, presumably, to think there must be some similarity of what the thing is that looks like that.
I think this is a wrong intuition. It only has to do with our capacity for observation, the limitation of our senses. I think in terms of categories, a corpse is a very different category than a sleeping body or an anesthetized body. Because if you could gain access to all the relevant information, they would be entirely different. A dissociation is a doing. It's not a thing. Under analytic idealism, there is only one thing, which is that subjectivity, that field of subjectivity. A dissociation is a particular pattern of doing of that thing. So there are no things other than subjectivity under analytic idealism. Everything else is a doing or an echo, a footprint of a previous doing. And these are the two categories then: an active doing, a doing that is ongoing, and a doing that has finished, but it has rearranged the states of its cognitive neighborhood around enough that when it stops doing it, things don't just immediately pop back to how they were before. Why would they? Nothing in nature behaves like this. When it stops raining, the ground doesn't dry up immediately. When something burns, it doesn't burn everything that there is in there to combust. No process in nature, like ends binary. It always leaves signs behind. A footprint, imprinting the footprint would be the doing, is the doing of stepping on a puddle of mud. And what's left behind is the reconfiguration of the surroundings when the doing stops, when it's no longer being done. So the image of the dissociation, which is a doing, is a dynamic image because it's the image of a doing, not the image of a thing. There is no thing that is dissociated. It's a doing of the one thing there is. And the corpse is a different category. It's the residual arrangement of nature after that activity has ceased. Things don't just magically pop back to their original state. Why would they, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, it's fine. So you have a pretty full-blooded monism going on there then. So it's that there's the one thing and everything else is a doing.
I'm a very committed monist, rationalist, reductionist, and empiricist. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. So that I was going to say it will come up later. Maybe it'll come up next week or whenever we continue this. All right. So the next sort of 4 questions are all quite a big thing I wanted to ask you. So I could leave that for next week. This is to do with your justification for not crediting mind at large with meta consciousness.
Okay.
So I think I'll park that, given that we're running out of time here. But here's one that's sort of along the lines of similar things you said before. So one of the selling points of analytic idealism that you present, and I think is right, is its ability to deal with the hard problem of consciousness. Right? The hard problem of consciousness is something like this. Given matter, there's no way to jump the gap from, you could put it in terms of matter to mind, or you could put it in terms of third person to first person subjectivity, or something of that sort. And the way it solves it is by saying that, well, no, consciousness is what reality is. It's a primitive. It's a primitive from which you build, which I think is right. But I wonder if, maybe this is a little bit related before, but anyway, but I wonder if there is a kind of hard problem for analytic idealism in the neighborhood. So one of them is less severe, agreed, but in the neighborhood. So one is that how you get meta consciousness from what you call phenomenal consciousness.
Oh, yeah.
As I know in Baloney, you have the metaphor of the mercury sort of whirlpools reflecting, but I honestly didn't know how to make sense of that and as an explanation anyway. So I don't know if you have more to say on that.
That's in the idea of the world. But yes, let's talk about that. Yeah.
A fuller explanation is in the idea of the world.
Yeah, it's in the most academic of all the books.
Right. Okay. So
there's a chapter there that is explicitly about this. No metaphors.
Okay. All right. We'll answer that one then, and then I'll ask the second potential hard problem.
Yeah. I didn't come up with anything new here. I'm just leveraging neuroscience, particularly, for instance, a paper by. It's a paper from 2002 about the dissociations between consciousness and meta-consciousness. I forgot the name of the author, who is an acquaintance of mine, a friend of mine, but he will forgive me. Jonathan Schooler, and the reason is that because of my tinnitus, I take amitriptyline, and one of the side effects is that sometimes it just blanks you. I just get a blank when I'm trying to remember a small detail about something. Sometimes I just blank out. It's okay. I've been living with this for 5 years now. So Jonathan Schooler showed. And that's very useful for theory making because it shows us what nature is doing. And therefore, theory should follow that and not nature follow theory, right? What he has shown is that the raw experience can deviate from the meta-conscious account of the experience. In other words, what you tell yourself about what you are experiencing. And that has been experimentally shown, that people can tell themselves about what they experience, something that actually doesn't match the experience because the experience was under controlled conditions and it was given to the subject. So what this immediately shows is that meta-conscious states are not the original experiential states. They are separate states that attempt to mirror the original experiential states but don't always succeed. And Schooler, or Jonathan, he calls it re-representation. So he talks about raw experience as a form of cognitive representation, which is fair enough. It's the language of neuropsychology. And he talks about metaconscious states as re-representations. When at a higher metacognitive level, you create an attempted copy of the lower experiential states, but now reportable. Reportable because now they get into these re-entrant loops of cognition in which not only you have a re-representation of the experience, you can report on it because you're reflecting back on it. There's a lot of psychology involved in this, but it's not mine. It's not new. I give me no credit for this. Another paper that informs us about this is Ned Block's access consciousness and the distinction from phenomenal consciousness. So you could regard metacognition as the combination of the two. You have phenomenal consciousness, so it is phenomenal, but it's also accessible at the metacognitive level. So that would be Schooler's re-representations. So that would be the account of metacognition. It's when mental space sort of folds in upon itself and creates these re-representations at a higher cognitive level, which are then reportable. And there is a lot of empirical substantiation for this, to the extent that in 2015, there was a paper by Nao Tsuchiya, a young but extremely bright Japanese neuroscientist. He wrote this paper about the no-report paradigm. And the idea there was neuroscientists of consciousness have become so fed up with the inability of subjects to correctly report metacognitively on what they are experiencing that they started trying to find ways to bypass reportability altogether because it's not very reliable. And that gives us a lot of clues about what is entailed by metacognition. For instance, it has been found that for an experience to be metacognitively reportable, you have to have back and forth communication between different brain areas. It entails a loop of some form, which is the re-representations, which is this mind folding in upon itself. That burns metabolic energy. It requires sophisticated anatomical structure in the brain, especially here in the posterior hot zone. There is a very reasonable hypothesis. I don't want to attribute it to a person yet because I don't know whether the person is prepared to say this publicly. But whenever he does say it, you will remember that I said I think it's a brilliant hypothesis, which is the following. You have those re-entrant loops of information integration here in the posterior hot zone. They are responsible for the phenomenal part. But when those extend into the prefrontal cortex and form one hi-fi complex, that's your access consciousness. That's the re-representation. Only then do you report. And if you break the link between the two, if you break this loop, you can have a dissociation between metaconsciousness and consciousness in a form. For instance, and now this is an example that I interpret this way. I know Christoph Koch interpreted this same example in a different way. So don't take this now as absolute fact. Everything else I said so far is standard neuroscience. Now it's my own interpretation. I think, for instance, blind sight represents this break between raw experience and reportability. So when this loop gets cut, now the patient sees, because if you throw a ball towards the patient raises his hand and catches the ball. But if you ask the patient, have you seen the ball? They will say, no, I haven't seen the ball. And if you confront them with this contradiction, they confabulate. They will say, no, I just happened to raise my hand and it happened that the ball hit it. So there are different ways to interpret this, but we know that blind sight is correlated with a severance of a back and forth communication in the brain because of an anatomical injury, some impairment there breaks this back and forth communication and you get blind sight. That's when you have phenomenal consciousness, but not reportable access consciousness. You don't have the re-representations. So this we evolved. It's not there to begin with, because to begin with, neurosystems are simple. They do not have the sophisticated structure, the anatomy, and the function required for fermentation to fold in upon itself, entailing all these different brain areas. But some form of self-awareness, some form of deliberate planning of action was evolutionarily very advantageous. So when it happened, it got fixed in the genome, and it has been built upon to the extent now that we are so metacognitive, we torture ourselves. That's the fate of humankind in the 21st century. Nietzsche's Last Man. The last man tried to anesthetize itself because its metacognition is constantly torturing him in Nietzsche's sexist, non-gender neutral old language. I'm saying that because I'm sticking to his language, the letzte Mensch, the last man.
Mm-hmm.
The last humans actually is the best translation. It's a poor English translation, the last man, because in German, it's the last human. So it's actually gender neutral. Yeah.
There you go.
Sorry for this long tirade.
Yeah, well, we could blame Nietzsche for a lot of things, but maybe not for that. All right, so I mean that explains what metaconsciousness is, I suppose, for an explanation how the one could arise from the other. We could pin on evolution, which is in the set of questions that I'm not asking tonight, so we'll leave that one for later, including about how seriously take dissociation, but we'll leave that. But the other one was, and this is where I'm not so sure based on something you said before, but my understanding of your view was that mind at large was only experiencing what you call endogenous mental states, which are non-perceptual.
Yeah.
Non-perceptual, but then non-perceptual.
Non-perceptual. Of course, if there is an outer within, then something akin to perception happens on the other side as well. Right? But an outer, when an outer forms, you always have at least two outers, because a boundary defines an inside from the outside.
Yeah.
So, but of course, in the original mental state, mind at large, is at a totally different scale, a much larger scale. So it's not really intuitive to speak of it as an outer itself. And whatever perceptual states it has, it's how it perceives us. And we are tiny little things running around a rock in an immense, incommensurably vast universe. So at the limit, mind at large does not perceive. Certainly not to the overwhelming fashion that we perceive. We perceive a world around us, but strictly speaking, mind at large is itself an outer, and it has dissociative boundaries between it and every living being. So at that boundary, something of the same category as perception would happen, but it's like seeing a tiny little thing within as opposed to an immersive world around it.
Okay, so then, because if the boundary, the dashboard of mind at large is, I mean, there's a plurality of dashboards in mind at large, right?
Now I have to be careful. The dashboard exists in a boundary. No boundary, no dashboard.
Yes.
But a dashboard...
was on the boundary, right?
It's on the boundary. Yeah, it's a Markov blanket.
Yeah.
But of course, what we refer to as a dashboard is something that evolved to collect information about the environment, because we are surrounded by an environment, and we cannot maintain our dissociation if we don't know something about the environment, where there is food, where the threats are hiding. Mind at large did not have that evolutionary impetus. So it does have boundaries with its respective alters, but it surrounds the alters as opposed to being surrounded by them, and it's not fighting for survival in a planetary ecosystem. So it stands to reason that it didn't quite evolve a dashboard, even though there would be impingement. So there would be some kind of sensing, but extremely minute and not reinforced by evolution, not amplified by the specialized sense organs that we have evolved. Think of it as, look, we have skin, and when a photon hits our skin, it does deposit energy, and that energy is picked up by the tips of our nervous system, but we hardly register it. We would register it as heat, but hardly register it. So what we evolved to do is to evolve retinas, where when the same photon impinges and the same energy is imparted, Now it gets amplified through a chain of mechanisms until it's interpreted in the brain. You can see a single photon, by the way. Human beings can see single photons. It's experimentally shown. So imagine perception as the evolved retina that picks out and amplifies everything that is relevant. And think of the boundary from mind at largest point of view as just a photon hitting your skin, because it had no stimulus to improve on that, to amplify that. It's not trying to survive. So yes, categorically speaking, it's the same category as perception. So we are talking about a difference in degree, but it's a massive difference in degree, so much so that it's in effect like a different category.
Okay. All right. So this may not then be relevant, but we'll end with it anyway, because I thought it was interesting. It seemed as though, let's see if I've got it next up here. Oh no, it involves something else a bit before that. So there isn't this hard problem. So the second kind of hard problem akin thing I thought was how perceptual states, how you get from endogenous states to perceptual states. Now, so it sounds to me as though you're saying that, well, from the earliest times of life, whenever that was, there have been perceptual states, even if they were not amplified, as you're talking about. So you
absolutely.
So you had sort of baked in, because certainly on the videos I've seen on YouTube, you sort of say one of them you were accentuating that it just had these endogenous states of thoughts and so on. But
oh no, not an outer corresponding to a living organism. Even an archaeon, the most evolutionarily speaking primitive living being, has a membrane, and the states of the world impinge on that membrane, and they will register. Archaeons go about the world. They don't have vision. They don't have sense of flavor or anything, but they still sense their environment in a very simple way. Parameciums sense their environment. Amoeba sense their environment. Amoeba even build little houses with mud particles. So every living being has something that belongs in the same category as perception, and so does mind at large. But of course, what we call perception is a much refined, evolved mechanism that picks out those very faint impingements, amplifies them, and elaborates them in order to really impress on us what is salient about the environment. But something of the same category has been there from the get-go. It's inevitable. If you have a Markov blanket, which is the definition of an outer and of life, you have something of the category of sense perception, because that's what a Markov blanket is. It's a set of states that can be impinged on from one side and impinged on the other side. It's perception.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll ask this question anyway, because but I think you've probably half answered it. So this is my thinking. So you say that analytic idealism is ontologically reductive, but instead of reducing mind to matter, as the physicalist does, it reduces matter and mental perceptual states to a mind. I was going to say endogenous, but just a mind anyway. So it seems we set up then there's how things really are, which is mind at large with its excitations, and then what those states look like from across a dissociated boundary, which are the physical objects that appear on a dashboard. Yeah?
Yeah, which are themselves also excitations.
Which are themselves excitations, right, exactly. So the physical objects are just what excitations look like.
Yeah, an excitation modulating another excitation. The second one is our perceptual states.
Right.
They are also excitations, but they are modulated by external excitations, all in the same medium. Okay.
Yeah, that may make things... I can see that now we've discussed how Friston relates to your theory. So I've got here, so what the dashboard appearances, i.e. physical objects, really are then are not material objects, but they're excitations of mind at large. So I wondered if there might be some kind of zombie argument that might apply in this case. Okay, so it would be something like this. If physical objects are endogenous mental, so scrap endogenous, if physical objects are mental states or excitations, why are they accompanied by perceptual experiences? And we could conceive of a world where mind at large and its alters are exactly as they purportedly are, but there is no looking like occurring on the dashboard. If so, there must be more facts in our world than facts about mind at large and its excitations. So concludes the alternative zombie argument. Therefore, analytic idealism fails to reduce physical dashboard objects to mind at large. There must be some kind of irreducible and fundamental perceptual states. So perceptual states in contrast to excitation. So in other words, you still have a certain kind of distinction in your model between what things are and what they look like, which has a certain kind of dualism to it. And you could imagine a zombie argument that tries to pry that gap open, saying, why can't you just have the excitations and there's just nothing that it looks like?
But you have that too. It happens too. There is an there are gazillions of excitations going on in China right now. They are not creating perceptual excitations in us. They're not close enough. They're not within the range in which an external excitation here can modulate an internal excitation here through the intermediation of the Markov blanket. So this happens. It happens all the time. Now, the reason why it's not the only thing that happens is that it's very evolutionarily advantageous to not only allow for this cross-dissociative boundary modulation, an impingement onto a dissociative boundary, which impinges internally, creating excitation internally that in some way corresponds to the one that is external. It's not the same, entropy bound and all that, but two excitations, this modulating this one being the internal. It's extremely useful for evolution to latch onto this natural process of impingement, cognitive impingement, and amplify it because it conveys to us information about what's going on here. So it's natural that it would be picked out and amplified.
Yeah, so I guess I'm talking about just sort of conceptually here. So, I mean, the zombie argument isn't trying to say that, as a matter of fact, maybe there are no philosophical... I mean, you assume that there are no philosophical zombies, but because it's conceptually possible, it means that there must be more than the physical facts in the world, because you could have all the same physical facts without...
I understand.
Without the mind. So now I'm saying you could have all the same physical facts about the excitations in mind at large and the excitations even within its alters and the processing of information across the Markov blanket without there being anything it looks like.
Yeah. So in that
from
case,
within the boundary.
You would still have external states because from their own perspective, they are endogenous.
Yeah.
But these external states would not modulate internal states.
Well, they could modulate it, but there's nothing it looks like to be modulated.
If by modulating we mean to influence the pattern of excitation that is in here, then that pattern of excitation is by definition an experience with certain qualities. Because that's how I model things. The only thing that exists is the subject. Particular experiences are particular patterns of excitation. So if there is an excitation inside the alter, endogenous or otherwise, in other words, endogenous or modulated by an external excitation, if there is an excitation of any kind, then there is something that is like to be the alter, and the alter is no longer a zombie, even if the alter does not perceive anything. Now you might say, well, what if these endogenous excitations wouldn't arise in the alter? Well, empirically, that's not mind works. Mind is always self-excitable. It takes people 30 years of meditation training to quiet the mind for a few brief seconds. And even then, they still report that there is something to be in that state. So there is still an excitation. It may be a very primitive, simple one, but there is still something there.
I guess I think the concern is more a conceptual one, right? It's just that excitations are understood as things. I mean, and this could just be a failure of the metaphor, which you've sort of admitted that will always occur in this. But an excitation sounds to me like what we might have called a primary quality. It's a motion, or it's a shape, or it's a pattern, right? That's what an excitation is. Mm-hmm. A looking like is a first person kind of experience. So it sounds as though it sounds as though I could have the excitations, I could have the Markov blanket, I could have the inner mental states, I could have everything that you want. Everything is set up in your theory, and you're not having what it looks like
That
in
would only
addition, because
happen, that is only conceivable if you say the alter would have the Markov blanket, it would have an environment. These two things could be excited, but there would be no excitation of the internal states. Then there would be nothing it is like to be the alter. Yes, this is conceivable. It's another question whether it's metaphysically possible.
I think you can have the excitations and also not have that. So, I mean, you want to say, no, you can't, because the excitation just is what it looks
no,
like.
I think it is conceivable that there be a field of subjectivity that it's completely, it's totally unexcited. And therefore, there would be no experience. There would be only the potential for experience, because that's the definition of a field. The field is defined as the potential for an effect. It's not defined intrinsically, it's defined in terms of its effect. If the field is consciousness, then it's inescapable to define it that way, because if there is no experience, there's nothing to talk about, right? All we can say through abstraction is that a field of subjectivity, non-excited, is the inherent, immanent potential for experience, but not the experience itself, because the experience is an excitation. It is conceivable that the universal consciousness could be experience-free, because it's in a complete state of rest. That's not, however, necessarily metaphysically possible. It's conceivable, but conceivability does not imply metaphysical possibility, let alone physical possibility. So one could say that it is a primary property of this thing that is the universal consciousness. It's a primary property of it, that it is always self-exciting. There is always a basic carrier, an excitation carrier that gets modulated in all kinds of ways, but when all modulation cease, you still have the carrier wave, the primary harmonic, so to say.
Okay, so
you could yeah.
I think I'm just not communicating it very well. So, and I know we're about to run out of time, but I suppose the issue is, if you attempt a physicalist reduction, you do that by identifying subjective mental experiences with states of the brain, and then you say, and there's nothing else there. And the zombie argument's trying to sort of pry that gap open and say that, well, we can at least conceive of, insert physical story here, expressed in third person terms, without having the first person experience that you are identifying with it. I just wonder if there's a similar thing we could say about analytic idealism.
Yeah.
Once you express it all in third person terms, in terms of excitations, in terms of Markov blankets, in terms of and we just have the field and the excitations of the field.
Yeah.
You could have all of that without there being anything looks like.
If it's not excited, yes, it's conceivable.
But why couldn't you have it excited and yet not look like, conceptually?
Because of how I define excitation in the metaphysical model. So this is a feature or an error of the model.
Right, okay.
The model it models experience as excitations. So what I'm saying is that the way to think about experience is as an excitation of the subject, because this avoids the dualism between a subject that has experiences as something other than the subject, and now you don't have perfect reductionism. And I think that's totally inflationary and unnecessary. So I say the experience is the subject in movement. It's an excitation of the subject. That's how I model experience. So to conceive of a subject that does not experience is to say, in the model, in the framework of the model, that the subject is there, the field is there, but it's not being excited. That is conceivable, but it's not necessarily metaphysically possible. It depends on how you construct your metaphysics.
So, okay, I think that's very helpful. I think then the mistake that I was making is that I took, when you say that your view is reductive, I think I was reading the reduction the wrong way. I thought the idea was that you're reducing everything, including the, when you're reducing the physical to the mind, I took that to be the appearances, the looking likeness on the dashboard to sort of some sort of modeling, third person understood excitations of mind at large. Whereas now you sort of explained to me that when we think of excitation, we should actually be thinking about experience and
Yes.
not some kind of, and I suppose maybe it's the kind of metaphor of the drum or the string having certain vibrations that maybe gave off a whiff of sort of ending up with something a bit like motion and primary quality stuff, whereas you really want to push things the other way, which I like.
Yeah, I think history has shown us that reducing the complex to the simple has worked for 400 years. So it should be the preferred way of trying to do things. If it fails, then okay, we look at alternatives, but it should be the thing we try first. And experiential qualities, there are countless gazillions of. A practical infinity of experiential qualities. So we cannot have experiential qualities as ontological primitives because our reduction base would just explode. Nothing could contain the amount of stuff you're going to have to shove in there, right? And I don't think that works. I think the common thing that underlies all experiential qualities is core subjectivity. It is the subject, the recipient, the dative of those experiences. So in a preferred model, you would want to reduce the experiential qualities to the subject, which is the common term that is always there. How do you do that? How do you reduce the variety of experience to the unity of the subject? Well, physics has shown us how to do that since Faraday in the early 19th century in your country. Think in terms of fields. Experiences now can be thought of or can be modeled by excitations of the subject. And the subject can have infinite patterns of excitation, just like a river can have infinite patterns of rippling and whirlpooling, just like a guitar string, although it's one, can produce many notes. But there is nothing to the ripple but the river. It's not a separate thing. It's not a new entity. You cannot get a ripple and take it out to the river, put it under your arm and carry it home with you, because there is no ripple. The ripple is a behavior. It's a doing of the river or the lake. The same would apply for experiences or to experiences. There are no such things as experiences as things. There is only the subject, and the subject ripples in many different ways, which accounts for the many different qualities of experience. So the goal is to say the subject is the only thing that is there. And that's why the reduction base has only one element, and that one element also happens to be the sole pre-theoretical given of nature, because all theories are made in subjectivity, right? So it's pretty good. And the problem now you have is, how do I reduce the infinite variety of experiential qualities to that? Well, it's by thinking of experiences as excitations. If you do that, then by definition, within the model, you cannot have a zombie with excitations.
Sure,
because an excitation is an experience.
Yeah. Okay, that's right. Yeah, and it wasn't a zombie overall. It was merely an imperception, a zombie that didn't perceive things. And I think that was partly
conceivable.
But I think it's partly because I thought that your mind at large didn't have perceptual experience. I thought it was just endogenous because of something you'd said before. So that was sort of where my question was coming from. So it seems to me then, and this is wrapping up, promise. If I'm now interpreting excitations as a good way of modeling what we should fundamentally understand as experiences, then actually where you land is far less different to where I would land, which I haven't talked about my own views at all, which is that on the one hand, there is this unity, which is your subjectivity and its excitations, but you haven't actually provided, in a good way, I think, a fully reductive account, in as much as a thought is not a perception, is not an emotion, is not. So there's still this rich diversity in what you might call experiential kinds going on in us. Presumably, then, we don't know what it's like to be mind at large, but the diversity of experience isn't blurred or removed by saying these are excitations of subjectivity, because what we understand excitations to be is just the same thing as we understand that I am a unified subject that can think and feel and will and so on. The sort of our introspective experience in all of its rich diversity is actually preserved, it sounds to me, in your model, if I'm now interpreting excitations as what it is that makes all these things experience and not something else.
Correct. And this way of modeling experience has the necessary degrees of freedom. I mean, if you look at the science of cymatics, if you look at the different harmonics supported by a simple drum head, if you spread salt in a drum head and you excite it, there are so many different patterns of excitation in a two-dimensional drum head. Imagine in a hyperdimensional universe, which is what physics is pointing to right now, more than 4 dimensions. So it has the degrees of freedom to account for the immense, almost infinite variety of qualities of experience. Because in a universe this big, this high dimensional, how many harmonics are there? And countless.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Well, then it seems to me that I guess my remaining thing that I will discuss with you next time, and anyone listening will be able to look forward to, is why mind at large is not meta-conscious or even supra-meta-conscious, which seems to me where things should lead. But you have an evolutionary explanation for it, which I still can't make fit with your view. But that's what we're going to... So anyone who wants to know about that, anyone wants to know about, wants to listen to our conversation about what we can say about mind at large in our rudimentary way, about the kind of consciousness that it has, and then we are going to, I've talked to Bernardo, we're going to pick up our conversation, which we're both enjoying. We're going to pick that up in a week or so, probably, or in a few days, so watch out for that. And I also do still have all of the community questions that people submitted here to ask Bernardo and to discuss further as well. So if you're one of the people that asked a question, wanted me to ask a question, I still will be doing that. I just haven't been able to do that today. And we will pick up this very interesting conversation then.
Next time, I want to start by hearing from you why you think mind at large should be metacognitive.
Oh, okay. All right.
So I'll sit back and listen to you.
Deal. Okay. All right. I've got to go and do my homework then. Okay, great. So we'll do that. And in the meantime, thank you very much, Bernardo, for your generous time.
It's been a very sincere pleasure.
Yeah, and an exhaustive explanation of things. And for everyone else, by Analytic Idealism in a nutshell, unless you're a hardcore philosopher, and then the idea of the world was probably more up your street. Thank you.